Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science. Today is a solo episode, so it's just me today, Ryan Salisbury. Kris is looking for a job this week. He got a little distracted by the job hunt, just trying to get stable employment and stuff. So he totally forgot about doing the podcast, which is fine with me because I was kind of playing an excessive amount of Assassin's Creed Odyssey this week. So we were planning to do an episode on the history of sugar, like the sugar industry, especially in the Caribbean. But as it turns out, that's kind of a big subject, and the information on it is not collected, in one place especially well. So that's going to take a while. So maybe we'll do that for the next one. I know that Kris is out the week after next, so we will not have one that week, or maybe I'll do a solo one. So this one or the next one may be the last one of the year that we do. So I don't really have any specific topics that I planned on for this. So I just have been reading for the last couple hours, and I also asked for some listener questions. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of responses there, but I got a few, mostly from my friends in the group TM that I'm in on Twitter. But yeah, so I'm sitting in my living room right now, which is unusual. I've only ever recorded either in my basement with Peter on the Skype, or in Kris's living room in DC. So this is a new thing for me. So I have Jojo's Bizarre Adventure on the TV. I've been watching that for a while. I don't think you'll be able to hear it. I don't turn the TV up very loud, and the mic doesn't pick up a whole lot of extraneous audio. So, plus there's, I think this room's pretty acoustically sound. There's definitely no echoes in here, so I think that's pretty good. So, got a nice bottle of beer. So let's get into it. So I'll start with the listener questions, which are pretty brief. The first one is from Soy Boy of the Deep, who is at Half Astronaut on Twitter. His name is very hard to spell, so I'll put it in the show description. He's a good follow. He's a deep sea diver. Pretty cool guy, a narco dad, etc. So he asked, I'm going to pull up the actual text of the question because I want to read specifically what people are asking. So Soy Boy asks, we want the biography of you and Peter and how y'all became tight neighbors for story time. So Peter and I go pretty far back. I think I might have mentioned this in an early episode, but I can tell the whole thing. So the biography of me personally is I grew up in Northern Virginia, in Ashburn, which is a terrible place. It's basically where all of the government employees and defense contractors live, the ones that are like upper middle class. There's government employees that aren't so rich, and then there's the ones that are higher ups in the government. See Blair Fix's study on personal income versus hierarchy. And so they're the ones that are a few levels up in the hierarchy of the government, or they are engineers or what have you in defense contracting companies, which are all centered in Ashburn, Sterling, Herndon, Vienna, McLean, Tyson's, and a few other places. But mostly in Sterling and Herndon. That's where I think the majority of them are. So I grew up in Ashburn. I went to Broad Run High School, which is the same high school that Patton Oswalt went to. That's the claim to fame there. He I'm still mad about this. He actually did the he was the like the keynote speaker or whatever for the graduation speaker for the class of 2008. I was the class of 2007. So we just had one of our classmates who was a pretty good speaker. I mean, for a high schooler, and did poetry and stuff. He was our speaker, and Patton Oswalt was the fucking speaker for the class that graduated after us. So I'm pretty salty about that. Patton Oswalt's one of my favorite comedians. I think he's hilarious. I went to George Mason University. So contrary to my Twitter bio, which is fake, almost always, I did not go to Oxford or Harvard. I did not major in econ, and I didn't get a PhD. I got a BS in computer science from George Mason University, the Koch-funded university that gets $50 million a year from the Koch brothers. So, yeah, real testament to that organization that I managed to come out even more of a anarchist communist than I went in. Let's see. And since then, since I graduated, I've been working at a software consulting company, which basically just means that rather than developing a software product, we provide services to other businesses and organizations and government agencies that want custom software developed. So we specialize in creating survey systems with reporting tools. So that's our thing. So I'm somewhat of a data scientist, I guess. I'm pretty good at writing queries and what have you. So that's my bio. For Peter, obviously he's not here, so he can't defend himself from all the terrible accusations I'm going to make against him. But he was born in South Africa. I think he was born in Durban. And that's also where he lived there most recently. So he spent most of his life in South Africa. He spent a lot of time traveling around the world, and I think he did so mostly without a lot of money to his name. So he's talked to me about how he would go to a new place and just start. He learned really well how to ask if there's any work that could be done by, someone who's not an official long-term employee. So he worked in a lot of kitchens, probably doing dishes and stuff. And I know he's mentioned on here before that he did boat tours in the Caribbean. So he called himself Rob Kamen for a while, which is a pseudonym for him, which is because he was in the Cayman Islands, doing boat tours and shit like that. So he got to see a lot of rich people there and stuff, interact with a lot of folks like that, see a lot of yachts and stuff. I on the other hand have never seen a yacht in person, but I do. I have dealt with a lot of rich people because of the area that I live in, which is one of the richest areas on Earth. Let's see. I don't think he went to college, but he's had. Oh no, he did because he was a web developer for a while. So he had the same job as me for a while, but he didn't like it and got sick of it. So Peter basically way more competent than I am in almost anything. So he currently lives in Bahrain with his wife, and he's currently doing some crazy shit. So he's managing multiple businesses right now. He's been setting up an esports league that's focused on women in Bahrain. So the guy he's working for, who I think is some royal fancy man, he's kind of a progressive guy in that country, and So he's heading up this like female esports league, and he's also convinced the guy to start a project to help to try and reforest the island. So they're planning on planting 1 million trees there, which is really cool, I think. So just a testament to the power of business to actually do things, at least, to some degree. He's not solving every problem on the island, but it's definitely a good thing for these things to happen, I think. And so how we met, we were both in this thing that a lot of you might have heard of called the Zeitgeist movement. If you don't know what that is, there was a movie that came out, and I think it was 2005, 2006, called Zeitgeist, and it was by Peter Joseph, who is just a filmmaker guy, who just put it on Google Video, and didn't really expect it to go very far, and it ended up like blowing up. It was about like how it was sort of like anti-state, anti-capitalist, but there was no like coherent theory behind it, so I wouldn't call it like anarchist or anything like that. But yeah, it was basically about how the current society that we live in is unjust, and I think there was some like 9/11 truther stuff. I never actually saw the original Zeitgeist, or even the second one, Zeitgeist Addendum. So because of the popularity of the first one, he made a second one called Zeitgeist Addendum, and then there was a third one that he made, and I think it was like 2009, called Zeitgeist Moving Forward, and that one was basically about how there's going to be, a social collapse, and how, again, society is fundamental. The society that we live in is fundamentally unjust, and we need to create what some were calling a resource-based economy in order to deal with it. So it's very heavily inspired by this one guy, Jacques Fresco, who's like sort of a grifter. He basically like lives in, I think it's called Venus, Florida. Yeah, because his thing is called the Venus Project. So he basically like took technocracy and like post-scarcity anarchism and sort of mixed it all together with his personal ideology, which is like extremely like radical centrist. He's kind of a, I hate that there's no word for this besides STEM lord, but he's kind of a STEM lord. I want to say scientist, but someone who believes in scientism, they're a scientist. But that doesn't really work, obviously. So Jacques Fresco is kind of a STEM lord. He thinks that politics is all bullshit, and that we just need to like manage everything correctly, and that there's no like decisions that can be solved with political means. It's all technical. Everything's technical. So we just need to create the technically best system. So I both of us, Peter and I, were drinking this Kool-Aid for a while. So yeah, anyway, Zeitgeist movement. The Zeitgeist movement was created around this resource-based economy thing, the like basically technocracy thing that Jacques Fresco came up with, and Peter kind of rebranded and explained it in his own way through his film. And it was supposed to be like an activist organization to bring about the resource-based economy. But unfortunately, since both Fresco and Joseph believed in this idea of, everything is like politics is all bullshit, we just need to come up with a technically best system that exceptionally informed their activism. It really informed their activism. So the forms of activism that they took part in were basically go out and educate people on what a resource-based economy is. And then eventually, once everyone knows what it is, they'll say, oh, yeah, of course, that's the best thing to do. And then we'll just do it. So no power analysis at all. no thought that maybe some people just don't want that. They don't want everyone to be equal. They think that that's bad and it's commie bullshit, and that you're a danger to society and you should be killed. No thought to that whatsoever. So the movement kind of fizzled out after a couple of years, probably in like 2013 was like where it was just, a shadow of itself. So at one point there was like a social network that someone created using like a free tool to create your own social network called TZM Network. And that's where Peter and I met. So we both had accounts on there, and there were some forums on there. And so we were both big forum heads. I've been posting since I was probably like 10 years old. I started on Neopets, and then moved on to Gaia Online. And I also went on some random forums. There was an Invader Zim forum that I was really into when I was like 12, because that's the kind of thing that 12-year-olds love. So we met on the TZM forum, and we kind of lost contact for a few years, and then we found each other on Facebook, I think, through like the suggested friends. And we'd been talking for a while. We commented on each other's posts. We joined the same Facebook groups, and then eventually I wanted to start a podcast, and I didn't know anyone that could really keep up with what I was talking about, because most of my friends in real life aren't into politics, and they definitely aren't into economics or anything like that. So Peter was the only person I could really think of to join one, to like do a podcast with me. So I just asked him, and then we started it. So and he didn't ask, but I'll go ahead and say how Kris and I met. We actually met like a year and a half ago at whenever the Juggalo March was in DC. We both went there. And I'm not a Juggalo personally. I was never into ICP, but I thought it would be a fun thing to go to. And I definitely went there because I wanted to meet Brian and Brett from Street Fight. And there was a bunch of DSA people tabling there. I knew a few of those guys and gals and non-binary pals. So I started talking to Kris because he was hanging out around Brett and Brian, and Sam Knight and Sam Sachs were there as well, from the District Sentinel. So I was talking to all of them, and then Brett and Brian disappeared somewhere. So I ended up talking to Kris, and we were both like dying of dehydration. So we walked off to get water, and as it turns out, the National Mall is very far from any sort of free water. So we ended up walking like many blocks to get to a Pete's Coffee, where coincidentally one of my old coworkers was the store manager there. So we were so far from the event, and they were already going to start the actual march soon after we walked away from there. We thought we could make it back, but so we were like, well, I guess we missed the march part, so want to just hang out. So we just found a bar to hang out at, and then we hung out again like a few months after that, and then Peter said he wouldn't be able to do the podcast anymore, and so I thought, well, Kris is pretty knowledgeable about all this stuff, and he's in the area, so I have been wanting to record in person. So I asked him, and he was able to do it. So now here we are in season 3, episode 10. So that's the answer to that. Hope you found that interesting. Maybe I can have him give his actual biography in a later episode, but I would butcher it if I tried to give it myself. I know he's from the Midwest, and he grew up for quite some time in Indonesia. Those are the two main things that I can tell you. Okay, so the next question is from Cheech Guevara, which I love that name. And he asks, when will economic collapse happen? Let me, again, make sure I have... Yeah, when do you think economic collapse will happen? This is a big question. I'm not sure if he means like the next recession or like the kind of collapse that I was talking about in like the TZM movie, where it's like a serious and permanent social decline, a la the fall of Rome or Weimar Germany or something like that. So in terms of the next recession, I mean, the figure I keep hearing is, or the prediction I keep hearing is 2020. But I think that's from mainstream economists who tend to be very optimistic. They definitely, immediately prior to the 2007 collapse, they were saying nothing bad is ever going to happen in this economy. It's like this gravy train's going to roll forever. It's amazingly miraculous how stable and permanent all the growth that has been for the last bunch of years, and that's just going to continue forever into the future. So one of the only people that actually predicted the 2007-2008 recession was Professor Steve Keen, who wrote a book about it called Debunking Economics, which, it's about that and just generally how neoclassical economics is a load of shit. It's based on basically just assumptions all the way down, and anytime one of those assumptions is empirically tested, it just fails completely, and usually ends up being exactly the opposite of reality. So like one example is mainstream economics has always assumed that buyers are rational consumers with stable, ordered preferences. So like, if I have the choice between bread and coffee, I will always choose bread because that's what I prefer. And so I will rationally act in a way that gets me more bread than coffee because that's what I prefer, and that's how I maximize my utility. But someone did a study to actually test this to confirm, like, oh yeah, of course, consumers are rational and have stable ordered preferences. So we'll just confirm that with a little study here. And as it turns out, preferences are not stable. They're not strictly ordered, and they're not rational at all. So people offered the same choice multiple times would make different choices on those different times. And if you look at the assumptions of different parts of economics, stuff like this really like just absolutely destroys their models, because they use these kind of assumptions to make everything work the way that they expect it to, according to like how they view reality. So the mainstream economists would view political economy as first of all, it's just economics. There's no real politics involved other than like interference in the market equilibrium. So the market is just a collection of buyers and sellers, which is equivalent to exactly one buyer and one seller selling one product, which is output, which just means like money, basically. And prices fluctuate according to changes in supply and demand to reach like an equilibrium, just like a physical system. With like a thermodynamic system, things will move around, like energy will shift around until the whole system is in equilibrium. So they assume that's what the economy is like, which is all rooted in this idea that like the Newtonian worldview, essentially. Everything is based on like it's as if the world operates as a physical system, just like like a mechanical system would, or a thermodynamic system would. So they just assume that all of reality works like that. And maybe I can get into this in another episode, but according to a book I've mentioned a few times, Inventing Capitalism by Michael Perelman, early political economists actually believed that the economy was driven by like heteronomous force, and heteronomous just means like not like coming from outside. So to contrast that to autonomous. So when Smith talked about the invisible hand of the market, he literally believed that there was like a heteronomous force that drove changes in the market that weren't just caused by human actions. So even though like Austrian economics, which is like a fringe branch, is almost entirely full of shit, one thing they get right is everything in the economy is human action. Nothing just happens automatically. So anything that happens has to come from someone acting and doing something intentionally. But anyway, I'm getting way off track. So the economic collapse, the total social collapse, I don't know. It really comes down to a question of does capitalism actually need physical productivity and resources to function? Because the Marxist view, of course, is that capitalism is private ownership of the means of production that it reflects a physical, like an actual physical industrial process, and that the share of or the rate of profit declines over time, and that would eventually result in like the failure of the capitalist system. But then the capitalist power view, which is what I take and Peter takes as well. I think Kris is getting on board, but he's not all the way there. The capitalist power view on it is that capitalism is a system of distribution, that physical production doesn't actually matter at all, and that capitalism actually thrives on the sabotage of industry and not the growth of industry or the ownership of industry. So according to the capitalist power view, even if like the resource base starts to dwindle, that doesn't necessarily mean that capitalism itself is going to fail. I think if that does happen, the major players will shift significantly. Obviously, the tech industry isn't going to be, as big as it would be with fully functioning industry and plentiful resources. But if there is a social collapse, that doesn't necessarily alter the balance of power in terms of which state is in charge and who gets to control the resources that we still have left. So, obviously the U.S. military is aware that climate change exists and is a threat, and their plan to deal with it is to maintain U.S. hegemony and take what we can before the gravy train runs out of steam. So I think that like if not oil companies specifically, energy companies in general will still be extremely important, because people are still going to need energy even if we're going to have to make do with less. Landowners are most likely going to become even more powerful. Like basically all that would need to happen for capitalism to survive like a resource collapse would be for a state to maintain control and to be able to like reconfigure things such that they still have like a a set of capitalist institutions. It still has power over people that can be meaningfully exercised, and it does so in a way that is the highly technical capitalist form. So I think it's possible that economic collapse doesn't really happen until like we're basically living in fiefdoms, clawing the guts of the earth for whatever tubers grow wild because everything else is dead. I don't know. I don't think that economic collapse is a given. I think peak oil has been predicted for a very long time, and while obviously oil supplies aren't infinite, so they eventually do have to decline, I think that somehow they will well, I don't know. They've managed to put it off for quite a long time, and the U.S. For the last several months has been the number one producer of oil in the world, overtaking Saudi Arabia, mostly due to Texas, which they've we thought that the end of Texas oil was like in the 70s, and it turns out if you just fucking destroy the planet, you can get more oil out of it. So sorry I don't have a better answer to that question, but it's a really hard one. It would be really cool if I could get Steve Keen on here. He actually has a podcast as well, but it's almost totally Patreon, like premium episodes. It's like he puts out like 5 minutes of each episode, and like the rest of it's behind a paywall. But maybe I could get him on. He's definitely the less famous lefty economist between him and Richard Wolff. So I'm not holding my breath on getting Richard Wolff on here, and I think he's a little too Marxist for me. I think we would butt heads a little. I just recently saw a tweet of his that I thought was very inaccurate, where he basically defines what capitalism is, and he takes a very Marxist view, and said something about like private ownership of the means of production and all that stuff. And the reason that I don't think that that's a good definition, the private ownership of the means of production thing, is because every state system that has ever existed has been based on private ownership of the means of production. So like medieval states, they had a landowning class that wasn't like the government owned the land. They did much in the same way that they do now. Like technically the US government owns all the land in the United States because it has eminent domain. So even if you have a deed to it, if the state decides we need that land, then you're not really a landowner. So and I think that applies to just about anything. They can seize whatever they want. Property rights are just granted. They're not really rights. They're privileges granted to you by the state. And so I think private ownership of the means of production describes any state system. A class society describes any state system. Let's see what else. Production for profit. I mean, yeah. Any state is going to have production for profit. I think what really differentiates capitalism is its source of legitimacy, which is just your financial earnings, your ability to accumulate power through in the form of money faster than others, and it's like it's a more deferred system. So rather than everything being chartered directly by the state sort of sets up rules for you to create new parts of the state on your own, and it'll like give you money, like the government will give you money to fund your organization, but the act of forming it is initiated by a private party, and it's a highly technical system that uses capitalization to accumulate power as best it can. And capitalization, for those who haven't heard the Capitalist Power episodes, which I highly recommend, is valuing an asset according to its expected future value adjusted for risk. So previous systems operated on the idea of stock, and looked at value as something that exists in the present and not something that will exist in the future. And so I think those are the major differences: is the source of legitimacy, the technicality, capitalization, and the like allowing of non-chartered parties to initiate their own parts of the state. That was mostly off topic, but again, it's a very hard question. I'm sorry, Cheech. So my last question is from Chloe, and she asks, why? And the answer to that, I mean, it's a very philosophical question. I'll give you that, Chloe. I waited this one for a long time, and I think I have to say my answer is because. So I hope that helps. Let's see. So that's all for questions. So another thing I wanted to talk about is automation actually destroying jobs? We've been hearing for years about automation displacing jobs, and the prediction in like 2014, 2015 was it's going to get rid of millions of jobs permanently. We're going to start seeing the effects of automation extremely soon. There's just going to be tons of technological unemployment, and we need to institute a universal basic income to fix this as soon as possible. And of course, no one in the government listened to this. We might have mentioned something about it in passing, but obviously the Obama administration didn't do shit about shit, let alone create a sweeping radical change like universal basic income that would improve the lives of millions of people, especially those who were forced out of their homes by the economic collapse and the subsequent response to it, which instead of saying that people could stay in their homes even if they had some bullshit shitty mortgage from Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae or whoever it was, that they would give trillions of dollars to banks instead, who just gave it to themselves as bonuses, and just didn't do anything good with it. Okay, so my next topic is automation and whether it's destroying jobs or not. So big discussion over the last bunch of years is automation and its effect on unemployment. There was a lot of articles saying that technological unemployment is inevitable. This is actually, now that I think about it, this is a major part of the zeitgeist thing, that technological unemployment is inevitable, that robots will replace humans in doing jobs. It was basically like the post-scarcity anarchism thing, except without the politics part. So they predicted the end of human toil due to automation, but they thought it would just be this apolitical process that would just happen naturally, because it, something that's technically better will always replace something that's technically worse, and then eventually we'll just realize, now we need to do something different than what we've been doing, and now nobody has to have jobs anymore. We can just do a resource-based economy instead. So in like 2014, there was some study that analyzed like kind of predicted the potential for automation for technological unemployment, for getting rid of jobs. And in that study, they found that it would replace a lot of like middle income jobs. I think like 40% of them or something like that by like 2020 or 2030. And so far that has not really panned out. So I looked at two studies starting around like 536, one from MIT and one from the Brookings Institute. So everyone knows what MIT is. If you don't know what the Brookings Institute is, it's like a liberal centrist think tank. It's supposed to be like bipartisan or nonpartisan, but that just means like centrist. They believe, much like Peter Joseph and Jacques Fresco, that everything is just technically that politics doesn't matter, that it's just tribalism, and we just need to manage things correctly. So anyway, so the MIT study is decisively anti-automation has displaced jobs. It was focused on the 2000s when there was a major dip in employment. And so they were looking at what the possibility is for China and other Asian countries being the cause of the loss of employment for a lot of folks. And a lot of that was actually even prior to the recession. People were losing their jobs before then. And the Brookings study says that automation has had an effect, but this is what I've been maintaining for the last few years now, since I've gotten out of the Zeitgeist movement and techno-optimist crowd, that automation doesn't really cause net unemployment, but what it does do is displace people temporarily and lower the barriers to entry for a job, and basically overall functions kind of like the Marxist concept of a reserve army of labor. It's kind of like an implicit threat that you can be replaced at any time, and so the effect is that it reduces wages, or prevents wages from growing as quickly. So one thing that we all know is that from around 1974 to today, productivity and wages have not kept pace with one another. And just to explain what productivity means, because it sounds like it means the amount of stuff that we produce or how productive our industry is. But what it actually means is the number of dollars that you get out for every dollar that you put in. So if productivity goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean we're producing more stuff. It could just mean we're charging more for the same stuff, or we're making the same stuff while paying the workers less money to make it. So productivity and wages kept up for almost the entirety of the 20th century, and that was because of labor unions. Because in order for wages to keep pace with that, there needs to be, first of all, a strong balance of power in favor of workers, because structurally, the balance of power is extremely against workers. So labor unions, by grouping workers into a single organization, a single party, the bosses of the world are less capable of just going, like, if you demand something better, they're less capable of just going to someone else to work under the terms that they want, because the unions will act in solidarity with one another, and if they really have to, they'll stop work entirely and just completely undermine the business's bottom line. So through solidarity, they achieve a similar effect of being the boss and being a company, which is a singular entity. So it shifts the balance of power in favor of the workers, and so the workers' wages keep better pace with productivity and inflation. But since the 70s, the labor unions have lost quite a bit of their power. Their membership has gone down a lot. Right to work laws have been passed. I'm in a state that is like the right to work state. You can drive past the National Right to Work building. It's right at the intersection of Braddock Road and the Beltway in Northern Virginia. So yeah, if you ever go past there, go ahead and first of all set that building on fire. Hopefully with whoever the president of that organization is inside, and then go just a few hundred yards away to the Swiss Bakery, which is a really nice bread bakery that's right down the street, and have yourself a nice lunch because you earned it. That was not a real suggestion if the FBI is listening. So anyway, so this Brookings study, first of all, it's pretty devoid of any power analysis. So in the intro, they talk about the situation with wages and productivity keeping pace for most of the 20th century, and then, puzzlingly, completely baffling economists, they stopped keeping pace with one another, and their traditional methods of analyzing the economy don't work anymore because they were bad and they have bad assumptions. They're based on bad assumptions, and they're stupid, and they never worked. But somehow they do come to the correct conclusion that while automation doesn't necessarily add to net displacement of employment, what it does do is undermine the power of workers and lower their wages. So that was that. And the MIT study of the 2000s, it found that movement of jobs to overseas industry accounts for 2.4 million jobs in net unemployment during the 2000s. So both narratives are right, are somewhat correct in their own way. So stuff moving overseas did in fact cause a huge loss of jobs, and automation does hurt workers, but not in the way that we normally think of, which is it permanently displaces them and leaves them completely jobless, when actually it just does stuff like what Uber did, which is undermine an existing industry by making things less dependent on being a skilled worker or having a traditional employer, and basically circumventing labor laws and lowering pay and benefits. There's the automation thing. I would say that it is possible for automation to destroy jobs, but I don't think that it will, because capitalism extremely benefits from having people working all the time. That may seem counterintuitive, because just regular intuitive analysis, or I guess maybe a Marxist analysis, would say capitalism wants to reduce costs as much as possible. So, of course, if they have automation available to them, then they would just lower. They would get rid of all the workers. The workers are a detriment. They can strike. They can, they need vacations. They want health insurance. They want to be paid ever more as inflation goes up. They take bathroom breaks. They're unreliable. They go home and sleep. They don't always like upsell things to customers, even if the boss yells at them to all day. So you would think, yeah, sure, of course, if automation exists, then the capitalists will, of course, employ that. But there's a number of problems with that. One is actually, again, from Blair Fix's employment and personal income distribution and hierarchy. The more people that you have under you as a manager, the higher your pay is, or the higher the pay you can justify. David Graeber wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs recently. I have not read that one yet. Kind of on a not reading kick. These studies were the first thing that I read in a while, over the length of like a tweet. So I have not read that book yet, but I saw someone point out recently, also referencing Blair Fix's work, that a lot of the bullshit jobs that Graeber talks about, jobs that are just functionally useless and don't really serve any social purpose, exist to justify higher pay for managers because they have a higher number of people working under them. So, if you manage 2,000 employees versus 500, even if the 1,500 of those employees are doing functionally useless work, then you can say, well, I do a lot more work, managing these 2,000 people than, this guy in this lean company does managing 500 people. So I should get $1 million instead of $100,000 or whatever. So automation is not necessarily going to be used to replace workers because of that. Because fewer workers means less justification for higher management pay. And also because a machine and a human being are not exactly equivalent, are they? If you were to automate your workforce, first of all, when you do it, you have to do it all at once. You can automate certain functions gradually, but if you're going to commit to an automated assembly line, you have to do the whole thing at once, because these different machines have to work together. So they have to be organized and architected to work together. You can't just say pick a bunch of machines off the shelf that are each part of a manufacturing process. I have this machine spins wool into thread, and then this machine weaves thread into cloth, and then this machine cuts the cloth into a pattern, and then this machine sews the pattern together into a shirt, and then this machine puts the shirt in a package, and then this machine puts packages into a box, and then this machine puts it into a truck. You can't really build those gradually. They have to be specifically made to work together. You can't get them off the shelf. They have to be made to work together. Whereas that process done with humans, the humans can figure out how to make it work together. If you have machines, it has to be very precisely done, because a machine is stupid and can't make up for mistakes, not even slight ones usually. So if they're not organized specifically to work together and engineered to cooperate with one another, then they may not work, or maybe they do it first and you don't notice some like slight deviation, and eventually it causes some like catastrophic failure in the process. And so this also means that you have to spend a lot of capital up front. So you need a huge amount of capital to even attempt to do this automation thing, which, on top of needing a lot of capital, it also kind of locks the level of technology into whatever you pay for. So if you see that if everyone is saying that automation is proceeding at a huge rapid pace, and a machine that's supposed to last like 5 or 10 years is going to be obsolete in 18 months, why would you bother spending all the capital to replace all the workers when your machine is going to be obsolete soon, and your competitors could just wait a little bit and then buy the faster machines and overtake you. And then another thing is, if your business starts to do poorly, like if a recession happens, which everyone is predicting will happen in 2020, if you have human workers, you can just fire them until you can afford to pay the ones that are remaining on your workforce. But if you bought a bunch of machines, you can't just get rid of them and say see you later, and then save the money that you would have been paying them every 2 weeks. They're there, and you're stuck with them, and the only way you can get rid of them is while recovering your cost is by selling them, and that puts you in an inferior bargaining position. And if your business fails, then again, like a competitor could just wait until your business fails, continuing on with their human worker process. And once your business fails, you're going to have to liquidate all your assets, and they can just buy it on fire sale instead of when you're trying to recoup your investment and get like a fair price for it with, depreciation factored in or whatever. So that's another reason that I don't think automation necessarily means that workers will be displaced. And I think the most important reason is that a lot of times they just don't work as well. We've all probably by now had experience with the self-checkouts at grocery stores. And while it is nice to avoid having to interact with a person who has been ordered to make small talk with you and pretend that they care about your day or whatever, and you aren't really gonna unless you get to know them, you're not gonna like talk about anything serious or get any like good interaction out of them. It's just gonna be like bullshit small talk. Hi, how are you? Did you find everything okay? How's the weather outside? That kind of shit. But other than that, the self-checkout machines are vastly inferior to the human cashiers, because any slight fuck up and it requires a human to intervene and come fix it. Or if you're like me and you go every other day to the grocery store to buy alcohol and take it to the self-checkout, you have to wait for a person to come check your ID and punch in the numbers to make sure that you can buy that alcohol. And also, it's really easy to steal shit from a self-checkout lane. You can easily just like not scan something and put it in your bag anyway. And initially they thought of this, so they put scales on the machines. But as it turns out, it's really hard to make that work with any sort of exceptional circumstance, like having a big giant item that weighs a lot that you don't want to take out of the cart, so you have to scan with like a hand scanner, or someone leans on it and messes everything up, or it's not zeroed correctly, or what have you, any of that kind of shit. So they don't have the scale, so it's very easy to steal shit. So There's also like old people just don't like using them because they find them confusing. They find it hard to use them. So there's a ton of things working against automation. So we, back in like 2012, 2014, we all assumed that, oh yeah, of course machines work better than humans because, again, like I said before, they don't take breaks, they don't want higher wages or anything like that. But there's actually all sorts of factors that make automation not so appealing and not so strategically beneficial. So I think that's all I'll say about automation. So the last thing that I want to talk about is Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, which has been on the TV, but I have to admit it's kind of hard to concentrate on talking as well as watching an anime with subtitles. So I'm probably going to have to back up a couple episodes, but just a little brief thing on Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. I think it's based on a manga that came out in like the 90s, the 80s or 90s. Actually, yeah, it's the 80s because I mentioned something about like the aesthetic of all the characters, and someone said, oh yeah, it's that 80s thing where like all the guys had huge giant muscles and they just generally looked like cool badasses. But the anime I think didn't start getting released until the 2000s. So that's a really interesting part of it because, most anime based on a manga inevitably comes out with a ton of filler. Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, all those series that are based on manga. The anime catches up to them, and once it catches up, it has to put in filler arcs to allow the mangaka, the author of the manga, to come out with more of the story so that the anime can reproduce it in anime form. So kind of a unique problem that anime has, which I don't think has. I guess the only equivalent to that would be like Game of Thrones, which, as we all know, will never be finished because George R.R. Martin has found that he much enjoys the fame and attention that he's getting, and doesn't want the series to end. So I think Game of Thrones solved it in a different way. They just sort of went a different way with the series and stopped following the books. But I think that's pretty rare in anime. They tend to follow the source material pretty closely. They'll change some stuff, but not a lot. So JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has like quite a lot of time between the manga and the anime coming out. And so unlike any other anime, it has no filler to my knowledge, and the pacing on it is excellent. Like my biggest complaint about the One Piece anime is the pacing is so fucking bad. I still remember like the part where I realized how much I hated the pacing on the anime. Luffy was fighting, I think it was Doflamingo, and there was like one move that he did. He was basically like falling down, and he was also winding up a gum punch move, and it took him. It was like they stretched it out into like 2 or 3 minutes. Like he was falling extremely slowly. They showed the same like wind up on the same move like multiple times from different angles. It was just very bad. But JoJo is exactly the opposite. The pacing is outstanding. The first season just goes by in no time at all. Oh, sorry, there's someone at the door. Yeah. So anyway, the pacing on JoJo is extremely good. The first season went by in almost no time at all. And it's just very enjoyable to watch. The action is really good. That's the other thing is like, a lot of action shows, a lot of action anime especially is like, very dialogue heavy. There's a lot of time spent, the two guys like facing off with one another, kind of explaining their ethos and explaining their moves and all this stuff. Where Jojo's they do explain some of the things that the characters are doing, but the vast majority of what they're actually doing is action, is actual fighting, it's movement, which makes it really a lot of fun to watch. Even if you're not necessarily paying attention to the dialogue, you can still get something out of it. The character designs are very cool. They're colorful and bold. Surprisingly, even though Nazis love this series, very multiracial characters compared to almost any other anime series. Most of them are Caucasian or Japanese looking characters in almost any anime. There's a lot of dark skinned characters in this show. It takes place in actual places even outside of Japan. The first couple seasons are in England, I think, and Germany. So not all just centered around Japan, which is pretty cool. I think I would recommend it. It's not necessarily like the smartest show ever, but it's fun action. There's like a fantasy component to it. It's nice to have on in the background, where you can just like look up and see what's going on in the show. Or it's also good to pay a lot of attention to because it moves very quickly, so it keeps your attention pretty well. And some of the jokes are pretty funny. There's one in an episode I was watching before I started this where one of the characters was going to go to the bathroom and he runs screaming out of the bathroom and says what the fuck to the guy who like owns the place, and the guy's like acting coy like, oh, then what are you talking about, what's wrong? And he's like, what's wrong, like what the fuck is with the toilet? And the toilet has a pig head in it. And the guy says, oh, well, yeah, it's the pigsty was built too close to the bottom of the toilet, so when the pigs get hungry, they stick their heads out of the toilet bowl. And one of the guys that lives here, like, he lets the pig lick his asshole clean and stuff. Very funny shit. I can also see why Nazis love the show so much because, first of all, it's about like strong men in power struggles, and women in the show are mostly sidelined. And more importantly, one of the early protagonists is like an actual Nazi soldier, and he's portrayed as like a heroic guy with good morals, which of course is batshit. But I'm willing. I can overlook that for the rest of the show because he dies, and Another really cool thing about the show is the story is like multi-generational. So the first season follows the life of one guy, Jonathan Joestar, and the subsequent seasons follow like his grandson and his great-grandson. And so you start off in like Victorian England, and the season I'm currently on is in like modern Japan, which is pretty cool. I don't know of any other stories that have storylines that take place over multiple generations that could be useful in stories that have like radical sweeping changes to the reality of the story, but I think most authors aren't brave enough for that kind of thing, so I won't hold my breath for anything else like that. But yeah, I would say if you don't have a problem with Nazi main character, then JoJo's is a cool series to watch. Maybe skip the season with the Nazi because you could probably do that. The season that I'm on, I think you could watch by itself. Sorry we haven't done any anime stuff, but I personally haven't been watching much besides Jojo's and Attack on Titan, which is, I think, on hiatus right now. And Kris, I don't think, watches nearly as much anime as I do. But maybe we'll get Reed back on at some point in the future and talk about the latest One Piece chapters and where that story is going, because from what I hear, it's getting very exciting. So I have to catch up on that, but maybe we'll talk about it in the future. So that's all I have. I hope this was okay. I've tried to do a solo episode before, and it went very poorly, but I think I'm a more seasoned podcaster now, so I'm better at filling in time and deciding when to pause and collect my thoughts instead of just try to continue spinning my wheels or whatever. So, yeah, if you enjoyed that, listen to our other ones. If you want to look at our other podcasts, our site is I keep doing that. It's neighborsciencepodcast.com. Our Twitter is at neighborscidepod. I'm at Handle of Rye. Kris is at solidarity_goth. Peter is at bookcheekite, although he has not been tweeting because he's just so busy. Please give us a rating on iTunes because that helps with the algorithms and all that stuff. We're on Spotify now, so if you prefer to listen to podcasts on Spotify, well, I don't know if we're on now, but I told Podbean to host me on Spotify, and so hopefully we'll be on there soon. And we have a Patreon, patreon.com/neighborscience. For most episodes, there's a lot of audio that I end up cutting out. I usually put up the pre-show chat that me and Kris or Peter have before we actually start the episode. So every episode yields like half an hour to an hour of bonus audio. So if you subscribe to the Patreon at any level, then you can listen to all the bonus audio, and that includes all the bonus audio that we've released prior to this, which is mostly me sounding like a dumbass or making a joke that's just too edgy for the mainstream broadcast to have. So check that out. And hopefully we'll have a new episode for you next week. And if not, I will talk to you next year. Bye.